Fear was he's going to notice I'm still here in the office and that he was going to come for me.
That was Rosemary Ortiz, a staff at the leasing office at Alpine Apartments in Anchorage, Alaska. She watched her co-staff shot 7 times and killed by a tenant. Why? The tenant was enraged because he was served a notice. His lease will not be renewed, and to punish the apartment management, he stormed down there and took the life of one of their staff. It was supposed to be a normal Monday. The phones rang. Paperwork shuffled. Keys exchanged hands. Inside the leasing office at Alpine Apartments in Anchorage, Alaska, Josiah Goecker, a 34-year-old property manager, husband, and soon-to-be father of 2, was doing what he had done countless times before, serving the tenants in his care. But just after 2 p.m., the front door opened. A man stepped in silent, armed, and already decided. Jesse Lee Jones, 28, walked into that office with a loaded gun and 7 bullets meant for vengeance. He wasn't there to ask questions. He wasn't there to negotiate. And within seconds, Josiah lay dying, shot repeatedly, his hands raised in surrender, while a co-worker stood frozen, watching helplessly as the scene unfolded in terrifying clarity. Jones wasn't a stranger. He was a tenant, one recently served a non-renewal notice. But beneath that surface was a man unraveling, unemployed, using methamphetamine, under growing pressure, and soon to become a father himself. And still, nothing in his life story, not the drug use, not the stress, could explain the choice he made that day. Because Josiah wasn't a threat. He was a man with a clipboard and a kind voice. He didn't fight. He didn't flee. He did his job, and he died for it. And after 3 years, Jones' defense, the bid to deny justice, argued that Jones was depressed and traumatized by the thought of being kicked out.
He went downstairs. It wasn't a good idea that he took his gun, but if he was intending to kill, he would have just gone there and started shooting. But he wanted to speak with the person who was responsible for putting that notice on his door, and that's what he did.
What kind of trauma would make you shoot at a man 7 times? A man who was only doing his job and posed no threat to you at all?
And specifically tells Detective Clark, I went in with ill will and ill intentions to kill whoever gave me that notice.
This is not just a story about one apartment, one tenant, or one gun. It's a story about what happens when mental health goes unaddressed, when guns fall into the wrong hands, and when justice comes too late for the lives already lost. This is the story of a father murdered, a witness traumatized, and a justice system left to pick up the pieces after the damage is done. And it all began with a knock on a leasing office door. At approximately 2 p.m. on Monday, October 23, 2023, the calm within Anchorage's Alpine Apartments leasing office was shattered. Within seconds, the building's property manager, 34-year-old Josiah Goecker, would be fatally gunned down in front of a co-worker, a targeted, calculated act of violence that would send shockwaves through the community and eventually land the shooter behind bars for the next 77 years. The killer? A tenant. His name, Jesse Lee Jones. And according to investigators and courtroom testimony, his reason was chillingly simple. An eviction notice. The leasing office was not a battleground. It was a workspace. It was where rent was collected, where maintenance complaints were filed, where new tenants signed leases and old tenants received notices. Notices like the one Jones had been issued just days before the attack. It wasn't a formal eviction, but rather a non-renewal. Jones' lease would not be extended, and he would need to vacate the unit. He was not being thrown out on the street that day. But in Jones' mind, something snapped. Why? What turns a document into a death sentence? According to court documents and statements from the Anchorage District Attorney's Office, Jesse Jones had become increasingly unstable in the days leading up to the shooting. At 28 years old, he was unemployed, reportedly using methamphetamine and preparing for the birth of a child. Stress, financial pressure, and fear of homelessness seemed to be mounting. But investigators say none of that excuses what happened next. Security footage, later reviewed in court, showed Jones entering the leasing office that afternoon. Inside were 2 people, Josiah Goecker, the property manager, and Rosemary Ortiz, another leasing staff member. The office wasn't chaotic. There was no yelling, no warning signs. According to Ortiz's testimony, Goecker stood calmly behind the counter, trying to speak with Jones. But Jones wasn't there to talk. Without hesitation, Jones pulled a firearm from his waistband. Goecker raised his hands, a gesture of peace, a plea for calm. It didn't matter. In a matter of seconds, Jesse Jones pulled the trigger. Once, then again, then again. In total, 7 rounds were fired at close range. Goecker was struck multiple times and collapsed in front of Ortiz, who watched in horror as her colleague and friend lay dying. This was not a random act of violence. Prosecutors later argued that it was premeditated. Jones had reportedly made a disturbing statement prior to the shooting. "I'm going to get whoever gave me that notice." That whoever turned out to be Josiah. The aftermath was chaos. Jones fled the scene, leaving behind a trail of panic and devastation. Police were called. A manhunt began, and Anchorage, a city all too familiar with rising crime rates, was left trying to understand how a tenant dispute had just turned into a homicide. But who was Josiah Goecker? He wasn't just a leasing manager. He was a husband, a father, a son. According to public records and family statements, Josiah had a wife who was pregnant at the time of his murder. He also had a young daughter, a child who would now grow up with only photographs and secondhand stories to remember him by. Josiah wasn't armed. He didn't threaten anyone. He had no history of violence, no enemies, no motive for anyone to hurt him. His only offense was doing his job, issuing a non-renewal notice to a troubled tenant who would ultimately respond with lethal force. In the hours that followed the shooting, the Anchorage Police Department released limited information, but confirmed a manhunt was underway. 3 days later, Jesse Jones was located and arrested. The weapon had been disposed of. Toxicology reports would later reveal that Jones was under the influence of methamphetamine at the time of the killing, a fact his defense attorneys would lean on heavily during trial. But could drugs explain the precision of the act, the planning, the intent? By all legal and investigative standards, this wasn't a case of sudden rage or self-defense. It was, prosecutors said, an execution born of resentment and emotional collapse. A man, perhaps overwhelmed by his circumstances, decided that someone needed to pay, and Josiah Goecker, the messenger, became a target. As the first chapter of this case came to a close, Anchorage residents were left reeling. The Alpine apartment complex transformed overnight from a quiet residential enclave into the scene of a high-profile murder investigation. News outlets reported daily updates. Family and friends mourned publicly. The leasing office was closed temporarily. One central question remained. Was this avoidable? Was it a failure of mental health systems? A failure of community support? Or was it simply the darkest example of what can happen when desperation turns to violence? In the chapters to come, we examine how this moment, this single knock on a leasing office door, would unravel into a criminal trial, a shattered family, and a 77-year prison sentence that began with one man's refusal to accept that his time at Alpine Apartments had run out. He wasn't a police officer. He wasn't a politician. He didn't wear a badge or carry a gun. Yet on October 23, 2023, 34-year-old Josiah Goecker became the latest victim of gun violence in Anchorage, Alaska. A man shot 7 times in the place he worked simply for doing his job. But who was Josiah? Why did his death provoke such a strong emotional response from both the courtroom and the community? And what kind of man leaves behind a silence so loud it echoed through every minute of the sentencing hearing? According to public records, Josiah Goecker was a husband, a father, and a respected property manager. He worked at the Alpine Apartments in Anchorage, a relatively quiet residential complex where he was known not just for managing leases, but for being courteous, professional, and consistently fair. He didn't make headlines before his death. He wasn't a celebrity or a public figure. And perhaps that's part of what makes his story all the more devastating. Josiah was an ordinary man, a man who showed up to work, who helped tenants navigate housing issues, and who, according to multiple statements from coworkers, tried to de-escalate conflicts, even when tensions rose. In court, his character was never questioned. Witnesses described him as respectful, patient, and level-headed. His family described him as a deeply committed father who loved his wife and daughter fiercely. At the time of his death, Josiah's wife was pregnant with their second child. How do you explain to a child that her father was killed for doing the right thing? The courtroom heard testimony that Josiah never raised his voice during the fatal confrontation. When Jesse Jones entered the leasing office armed and agitated, Josiah stood calmly behind the counter. He raised his hands, not in fear, but in a quiet gesture of peace. It was a final act of civility that prosecutors later said embodied who he was, a man who sought resolution, not conflict. He never had the chance to defend himself. He never got to walk out of that office. During the sentencing hearing, 9 members of Josiah's family addressed the court. They spoke of his quiet strength, his love for hiking, his tendency to avoid drama, his habit of putting others first. They spoke of birthdays that would go uncelebrated, of a child who would never meet her father, and of a marriage cut short by a bullet fired by a man who felt wronged by paperwork. His brother Josiah Goecker, now a member of the Anchorage Assembly, gave one of the most emotional statements of the day. He didn't just mourn Josiah. He demanded better. He called on the community to recognize the cost of indifference, to understand that this wasn't just a tragedy, but a turning point. Was Josiah's death preventable? That question will follow this case through every chapter that remains. What is certain, however, is this. Josiah Goecker's name will not be forgotten. Not in Anchorage, not in the courtroom, not by his family, and not by the public, who continue to ask, how did it come to this? He walked into the leasing office with a loaded firearm. He walked out, leaving a father dying on the floor. But before Jesse Lee Jones became a convicted murderer, he was a tenant, one facing eviction, addiction, and a growing sense of desperation. Now he is serving a 77-year prison sentence for a crime that prosecutors say was no accident. But who was Jesse Lee Jones? What circumstances led a 28-year-old man to bring a gun into his apartment complex's leasing office in broad daylight and pull the trigger 7 times? And was there any warning before he crossed the line from tenant to killer? Public court documents and statements from the Alaska Department of Law reveal a man in decline. Jones had lost his job, was reportedly using methamphetamine, and was anticipating the birth of a child. His personal life, according to the defense, was unraveling. He was, by their argument, overwhelmed, struggling financially, emotionally, and mentally. But according to the prosecution, Jesse Jones wasn't just spiraling. He was plotting. In the days before the shooting, Jones received a non-renewal notice from Alpine Apartments. This wasn't a sudden eviction. It was an official notification that his lease would not be extended. He had time to vacate. He had options. But according to prosecutors, what he lacked was self-control. What he did next was documented in chilling detail. He allegedly made a statement that he planned to confront whoever gave me that notice. That statement would later be used in court as evidence of premeditation. So when Jones walked into the leasing office on October 23, 2023, prosecutors say he wasn't confused or looking for help. He had made a decision. And that decision would end the life of property manager Josiah Goecker. Jones pulled a handgun and opened fire in front of another leasing agent. Goecker, unarmed and cooperative, raised his hands in an attempt to defuse the situation. It didn't matter. Witnesses say Jones fired again and again, striking Goecker multiple times. Then he fled the scene. For 3 days, Anchorage police searched for him. He was eventually located and arrested. The weapon had been discarded. Toxicology reports later showed methamphetamine in his system. In court, Jones' defense team tried to argue that he was overwhelmed by personal pressure, that the killing was not calculated, but impulsive, that the influence of drugs combined with stress clouded his judgment. But the jury didn't agree. They saw a man who, faced with adversity, chose violence. They heard testimony that he threatened to retaliate against the person who delivered the notice. And they watched as prosecutors outlined the steps Jones took to carry out that threat, arming himself, entering the office, and firing with precision. So who was Jesse Lee Jones? A victim of his own downfall? A product of systemic failure? Or a man who made a deadly choice? Fully aware of its consequences, the court reached its conclusion. And now, the public is left to ask, could this have been stopped? It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't a fight. It was a printed letter, impersonal, procedural, and standard in apartment management. But in the hands of Jesse Lee Jones, a non-renewal notice became the trigger for a fatal chain of events that would leave one man dead and another bound for a lifetime behind bars. What exactly did the notice say? And how did something so routine, something delivered to thousands of tenants across the country every month, end in 7 gunshots inside a leasing office? According to verified court records and statements from prosecutors, Jesse Jones received a non-renewal of lease notification from the management of Alpine Apartments in Anchorage, Alaska. This was not an eviction in the legal sense. There had been no court order, no marshals involved. The notice simply informed Jones that the property owners would not extend his lease and that he would be required to vacate the unit by a future date. This is standard practice in property management. Reasons for non-renewal can range from changes in ownership to tenant behavior or failure to comply with lease terms. In this case, prosecutors did not focus on the apartment's reasoning for the notice. Instead, they zeroed in on how Jesse Jones reacted. According to witness testimony presented during trial, Jones did not inquire about extensions or dispute the decision through formal channels. He didn't seek legal help or request more time. Instead, he reportedly made a disturbing remark. "Whoever gave me that notice, that's who I'm going after." That sentence would echo throughout the courtroom months later. It signaled intent. It suggested that Jones had already begun to internalize the situation as a personal attack, not a business decision. Prosecutors used the quote to argue that the murder was premeditated. At what point does a form letter become a death sentence? Goecker, the property manager who signed the document, had no reason to fear for his life. He had not issued a personal threat. He had not knocked on anyone's door. He followed company policy and issued paperwork. He was doing his job, nothing more. And yet it was that job and that notice that marked him for death in Jesse Jones' eyes. Legal experts commenting on the case noted that this wasn't the first time a housing dispute escalated into violence. But the clarity of Jones' statement, the chilling directness of his response to receiving the notice, distinguished this case. It showed that he wasn't confused. He had processed the message, identified the messenger, and planned retaliation. Jones didn't return to the leasing office seeking dialogue. He returned with a loaded gun. In court, the defense would later argue that Jones' mental state was fragile, that the stress of housing insecurity and fatherhood clouded his thinking. But prosecutors reminded jurors that the letter did not demand immediate eviction. It offered time. It followed protocol. It offered process, not punishment. So how did a tenant notification evolve into a cold-blooded killing? That question haunts the legacy of Alpine Apartments and underscores the terrifying reality that even routine administrative acts can, in the wrong hands, become deadly. October 23, 2023, started like any other Monday at Alpine Apartments in Anchorage. The leasing office was open. Staff were attending to paperwork. Tenants came and went. There was no visible sign of what was coming. But just after 2 p.m., the quiet routine of that afternoon was shattered by gunfire. 7 shots. A property manager was left bleeding on the floor. A coworker stood frozen in terror. And the man who pulled the trigger disappeared into the cold Alaska air. What happened in those critical minutes? How did a place of business become a crime scene? According to eyewitness testimony and confirmed court documents, Jesse Lee Jones entered the leasing office at Alpine Apartments just after 2 p.m. He did not appear frantic. There was no shouting or warning. Inside the office were 2 employees, Josiah Goecker, the 34-year-old property manager, and his colleague Rosemary Ortiz. The encounter began with words, but what was said in those first seconds remains unclear. What is known is this: Josiah, standing behind the front counter, raised both hands in what appeared to be a calming gesture. He was unarmed. He was not aggressive. Ortiz would later testify that he tried to de-escalate. But Jesse Jones was not there for dialogue. In a matter of moments, he reached for a handgun. Witnesses described the movement as swift, deliberate. Jones pulled the weapon from his waistband and opened fire. 7 rounds in total, fired at close range. Josiah collapsed behind the leasing counter. Ortiz, who witnessed the shooting in its entirety, was unharmed but deeply traumatized. She would later testify during the trial, describing the moment in vivid detail, how her colleague fell, how she froze, how she feared she would be next. Jones didn't say anything else. He didn't attempt to help. He turned and fled the office, leaving chaos in his wake. The Anchorage Police Department was called immediately. Officers arrived within minutes to find Goecker gravely wounded. Despite emergency medical attention, he was pronounced dead at the scene. SWAT teams were deployed. The area surrounding Alpine Apartments was secured. Residents were urged to stay indoors. A manhunt was officially underway. For 3 days, Jesse Jones remained at large. During that time, police followed leads, reviewed surveillance footage, and collected witness statements. Jones had reportedly discarded the firearm and was using methamphetamine at the time of his arrest. Authorities confirmed his capture later that week. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a spontaneous altercation. It was a targeted act. Prosecutors pointed to the pre-shooting statement, "Whoever gave me that notice," as proof that the attack had been planned. And the evidence supported it: the timing, the location, the number of shots, and the fact that Josiah had been specifically identified as the one who issued the non-renewal notice. The gunshots lasted seconds, but their consequences will echo for decades. What started as a quiet afternoon inside a leasing office ended with a body on the floor, a witness in shock, and a community asking, how did this happen so fast? And why didn't anyone see it coming? When Jesse Lee Jones entered courtroom 502 in Anchorage Superior Court, the stakes could not have been higher. He stood accused of first-degree murder, third-degree assault, and evidence tampering, charges tied directly to the daylight killing of property manager Josiah Goecker on October 23, 2023. It was a trial centered on intent. Was this a cold-blooded execution, as prosecutors claimed? Or was it a desperate act by a man unraveling under the weight of life's pressures? As the defense argued, for weeks, a jury of 12 would be asked to examine not just what happened, but why. From the outset, the prosecution laid out a stark and unflinching narrative. Led by Assistant District Attorney Eviction, the state argued that Jones' actions were calculated. This wasn't an impulsive outburst, they said. It was a deliberate response to a perceived slight, a non-renewal notice issued by Goecker just days earlier. The state's case hinged on a chilling statement allegedly made by Jones before the shooting. "Whoever gave me that notice, that's who I'm going after." Prosecutors used that sentence as a linchpin of their premeditation argument. They asserted that Jones entered the leasing office with a specific target in mind, that he brought a loaded weapon, that he made no attempt to retreat, and that he fired 7 rounds at Goecker, who stood unarmed and with his hands raised. They called it murder with purpose, not panic. The defense, led by attorney Dan Lowry, did not dispute that Jones pulled the trigger. There was no denial that Goecker was dead, nor that Jones had fled the scene. Instead, the defense urged the jury to consider context. A young man overwhelmed by eviction, unemployment, substance use, and the impending birth of a child. Jones, they claimed, was under immense psychological strain. His actions, though tragic, were not the result of long-term planning, but of mental collapse. He was not a killer by nature, they argued, but a man without resources, drowning in stress and paranoia, who made a terrible, irreversible decision. It was an uphill argument. The most powerful testimony came from Rosemary Ortiz, the leasing agent who witnessed the entire event. Her account was calm, clear, and devastating. She described the moment Jones pulled the gun, the way Goecker raised his hands, the sound of the shots. Her testimony was consistent with video footage and forensic evidence. The prosecution also presented evidence that Jones discarded the murder weapon and fled the area, remaining at large for 3 days. When captured, he tested positive for methamphetamine. These facts further damaged the defense's claim of temporary insanity or diminished capacity. In the end, the jury deliberated on the central question: was this a spontaneous act of desperation or a premeditated killing? They reached a unanimous conclusion: guilty on all counts. And with that verdict, the court prepared to close one of the most emotional and closely watched trials in recent Anchorage memory. But the story was not yet over. Sentencing would bring its own reckoning. For Jones, for Goecker's family, and for a city still searching for peace. The courtroom fell silent as the clerk stood to read the verdict. 12 jurors, all Anchorage residents, had spent hours deliberating the evidence, the arguments, and the law. Now, after weeks of testimony and emotionally charged proceedings, their decision was final. Guilty. On all counts. For the family of 34-year-old Josiah Goecker, the verdict marked a moment of long-awaited justice. For Jesse Lee Jones, it sealed his fate as a convicted murderer. And for the public watching from beyond the courthouse walls, it was a stark reminder of how quickly an ordinary dispute can spiral into irreversible tragedy. But how did the jury come to this decision? And what evidence ultimately swayed them? Jurors were tasked with evaluating 3 felony charges. First-degree murder for the intentional killing of Josiah Goecker. Third-degree assault for placing co-worker Rosemary Ortiz in fear of imminent harm. Tampering with evidence for discarding the murder weapon after the shooting. The burden of proof was high. Under Alaska law, a first-degree murder conviction requires the jury to find that the defendant acted with intent and premeditation. Prosecutors pointed repeatedly to a statement allegedly made by Jesse Jones before the shooting. "Whoever gave me that notice, that's who I'm going after." That line, delivered in the days before the attack, became central to the state's case. It suggested planning. It suggested motive. And most importantly, it suggested that Jesse Jones had already decided to confront and possibly harm the person responsible for the non-renewal of his lease. That person was Josiah Goecker. Key testimony from eyewitness Rosemary Ortiz was instrumental in helping jurors reconstruct the events inside the leasing office. Her recollection was supported by surveillance footage and forensic reports. She described Goecker as calm, non-threatening, and visibly trying to defuse the situation. Her presence in the room also supported the assault charge. She was feet away when the gun was drawn and fired. Forensic evidence showed that 7 rounds were fired at close range. Josiah was struck multiple times. There was no indication of a struggle, no signs of provocation. Jones fled immediately after the shooting and remained at large for 3 days. He was arrested while under the influence of methamphetamine, according to toxicology reports. The firearm used in the shooting was never recovered, reinforcing the charge of evidence tampering. The defense argued that Jones had acted under severe emotional distress, that he was overwhelmed, unstable, and not thinking clearly. But the prosecution maintained that stress did not justify murder, and the jury agreed. When the word guilty was spoken, it brought visible emotion from the Goecker family seated in the courtroom. For them, the verdict would never bring back a husband, a father, a son, but it brought something else: accountability. The justice system had done its part, but the final judgment would come not just from a jury, but from the sentencing bench. And that moment was still to come. The courtroom was quiet, but the weight in the air was unmistakable. On July 11, 2025, inside Anchorage Superior Court, Judge Andrew Peterson delivered a sentence that had been months in the making, one shaped by grief, loss evidence, and justice. Jesse Lee Jones was sentenced to 77 years in prison for the October 2023 murder of 34-year-old property manager Josiah Goecker. The sentence was severe, but, according to the judge, warranted. As he addressed the court, Judge Peterson made clear that the crime was not a momentary lapse, not an act of confusion, but a deliberate, violent decision with irreversible consequences. For Josiah's family, still navigating life without him, the moment brought a measure of closure. For the city of Anchorage, it closed the chapter on a trial that had gripped the community. But how did the court arrive at 77 years? And what did the judge and the people most affected have to say before that final number was read aloud? According to official court documents and statements from the Alaska Department of Law, Jesse Jones received a composite sentence of 77 years broken down as follows: 75 years for first-degree murder, 2 years for third-degree assault, served consecutively, 2 years for evidence tampering, served concurrently. In Alaska, first-degree murder carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years. However, given the circumstances of the case, including the planning involved, the number of shots fired, and the presence of an eyewitness, the prosecution requested significantly more. Judge Peterson granted their request, emphasizing the calculated nature of the crime. He cited the chilling pre-shooting statement attributed to Jones, "Whoever gave me that notice, that's who I'm going after," as clear proof of premeditation. He noted that Goecker raised his hands in surrender and posed no threat. Yet Jones pulled the trigger repeatedly. This was not an honest mistake or a spontaneous outburst, the judge said. This was an act of intentional violence against an unarmed man doing his job. Before the sentence was handed down, 9 members of Josiah Goecker's family took the stand to deliver victim impact statements. They spoke with emotion, clarity, and deep pain, describing not just the man they lost, but the void left behind. Josiah's wife, pregnant at the time of his death, described the heartbreak of preparing to raise 2 children without their father. She recalled the moment she received the call, the disbelief, the silence, the weight of having to explain to her young daughter why daddy isn't coming home. Josiah's brother, Jared Goecker, an Anchorage assembly member, called the murder not just a personal tragedy, but a failure that reflected broader issues, a lack of support for mental health, rising drug addiction, and the need for stronger tenant protections and community intervention. Josiah was a man of patience, fairness, and compassion, Jared said. He didn't deserve this. No one does. Other family members recounted holidays now marked by absence, a home missing its center, a daughter who will never hear her father's voice again. Their words were calm, but each sentence carried the weight of permanence. Jesse Jones did not speak during sentencing. His attorney, Dan Lowry, acknowledged the pain of the victim's family, but asked the court to consider the circumstances that led to the shooting. He cited Jones' addiction, financial hardship, and unstable mental state. While not minimizing the crime, he asked for a sentence that would allow for some measure of rehabilitation and eventual release. But the court was unmoved. In his response, Judge Peterson said the facts showed a man who had options, but chose violence. You could have walked away, he said. You had time to seek help, to talk to someone, to change course. Instead, you picked up a gun and used it. In the weeks following the sentencing, community organizations and housing advocates in Anchorage renewed conversations about safety, conflict resolution, and support services. While the court's decision brought legal resolution, the broader questions remained. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Was there a missed opportunity to intervene through social services, housing assistance, or mental health support? And what protections are in place for property managers, leasing agents, and others in frontline positions who carry out difficult decisions on behalf of landlords? As the hearing concluded, Josiah's photo was shown to the court, a smiling man, eyes kind, holding his daughter. The contrast between that image and the courtroom silence was stark. The Goecker family left with the knowledge that the man who took Josiah's life would spend nearly 8 decades behind bars. But no sentence, however long, could restore what was lost. Justice was served, but healing would take far longer. Anchorage has witnessed violent crime before, but the murder of Josiah Goecker, a 34-year-old property manager gunned down in his own leasing office, left a wound that went beyond a single family. This was not a gang-related shooting, nor was it a late-night street crime. It was a midday killing in a professional setting, carried out by a tenant in front of a coworker. For many in the community, it felt too close, too ordinary, too possible. In the weeks following Jesse Jones' sentencing, the echoes of the crime lingered in hallways, city council meetings, and community forums. Why did no one see coming? And what's being done to ensure it never happens again? At Alpine Apartments, where the shooting occurred, the leasing office eventually reopened, but not without change. According to property management sources and community reporting, new security protocols were introduced, including restricted access during tenant meetings and increased staff training for conflict management. Colleagues of Josiah, particularly Rosemary Ortiz, who witnessed the shooting, received counseling services arranged through victim support programs. Ortiz's testimony was crucial in court, but her trauma was deep. According to statements shared in court, she has struggled with flashbacks and anxiety since the incident. Her experience highlighted a broader concern. How are frontline property workers being protected when enforcing difficult housing policies? Property managers across Anchorage expressed fear that what happened to Josiah could happen to anyone. Community advocates questioned whether Jesse Jones' downward spiral from unemployed tenant to convicted killer could have been interrupted sooner. Was there a moment when social services, housing aid, or mental health support could have changed the outcome? The Anchorage Assembly, where Josiah's brother Jared Goecker now serves, took up these concerns. In the months following the trial, Jared spoke openly about the need for policy changes, advocating for greater funding toward housing stability programs and better mental health access for at-risk individuals. This wasn't just about my brother, he told reporters. It was about a system that failed two men, one who lost his life and one who threw his away. His remarks found resonance among many city residents. While no one excused Jesse Jones' actions, the case became a stark reminder of the thin line between crisis and catastrophe. For the Goecker family, the pain continues privately. Josiah's wife is now raising two children, one of whom was born after the murder. They will grow up hearing about their father through memories, not experience. At sentencing, several family members mentioned that the hardest part is explaining the absence. There is no easy way to tell a child that their father was killed simply for doing his job. No simple answer to why someone could respond to a piece of paper, a non-renewal notice, with fatal violence. Their grief became a symbol of something larger, the human cost of a fraying social fabric. Josiah's death marked a turning point in Anchorage's understanding of workplace safety and tenant conflict. Security at apartment complexes has since been reassessed. Mental health outreach programs have expanded, and the public has become more aware of how unaddressed stress, substance use, and isolation can escalate. Still, questions remain. Could someone have intervened? Could a better system have redirected Jesse Jones before he reached for a gun? And what protections are in place now to ensure this doesn't happen again? One man's death changed more than one family. It challenged a city to look inward and take action. The murder of Josiah Goecker inside a leasing office was shocking not only for its violence, but for its setting. A place associated with rent forms and maintenance requests became the scene of a calculated killing. The man responsible, Jesse Lee Jones, didn't act in a moment of chaos. He arrived with a gun, a target, and a motive. But beyond the courtroom verdict and sentencing, a more uncomfortable question lingers. What drove him to this point? And just as critically, what might have stopped him? Jesse Jones, 28, was not a career criminal. According to court records and information presented during the trial, he had recently become unemployed, was struggling with substance use, and had learned he would soon become a father. He was living at Alpine Apartments, where he received a non-renewal notice, a legal, standard form informing him that his lease would not be extended. That document, which thousands of tenants receive every year, marked a turning point. Prosecutors said Jones took it personally. Within days, he was armed and prepared to retaliate against the person he believed was responsible. What this case exposed is not just a failure of judgment, but a breakdown in resilience, and in the safety nets meant to prevent such violence. Mental health professionals watching the case noted that Jones displayed several warning signs: financial instability, increased isolation, substance abuse, and threats of aggression. Combined, these are risk factors known to escalate into violence when left unaddressed. Was Jesse Jones ever offered intervention? Was there a support system available to help him process the impending loss of his housing? Had anyone followed up after the non-renewal notice was issued? These are not questions of blame, but of prevention. Because while the justice system responded swiftly after the crime, there is little evidence that any safety mechanism existed before it. The case has also raised questions about housing policy and tenant communication. Property managers, like Goecker, are often on the front lines of delivering bad news. They are trained in leases, not in crisis de-escalation or behavioral health. And when notices are handed out, there is rarely a mental health response team on standby. Anchorage Assemblymember Josiah Goecker, Josiah's brother, has since advocated for better coordination between housing agencies and public health services. We can't treat these as isolated issues anymore, he said. Housing insecurity, untreated addiction, and mental health breakdowns all intersect. And when they do, the cost can be someone's life. The justice system did its job. Jesse Jones was tried, convicted, and sentenced. But as the city of Anchorage moves forward, this case stands as a chilling reminder of what happens when systems meant to support people fall short, and when desperation is left unanswered. Josiah Goecker lost his life because of a form letter. The tragedy lies not just in the act, but in the silence that led up to it. His name was Josiah Goecker. He wasn't a politician or a public figure. He didn't make national headlines during his lifetime. But in his final moments, standing behind a leasing office counter, hands raised in peace, he represented something much larger than his job title. He was a father, a husband, a worker doing his duty. And now, he is a name that the city of Anchorage will not forget. Since his death on October 23, 2023, Josiah's story has been etched into courtroom records, news articles, and family testimonies. But beyond the case file, beyond the verdict and the 77-year sentence handed to his killer, is the life that was stolen. Those who knew him describe a patient, kind, and principled man. He was known for treating tenants with respect, navigating disputes with calm, and always putting family first. His wife, pregnant at the time of his death, now raises their 2 children without him. What does justice look like for a man who never raised his voice, never carried a weapon, and never expected that doing his job could cost him his life? As the trial ends and public attention shifts, the risk is that Josiah's story fades into a statistic. That must not happen. His name should remain a reminder not just of what was lost, but of what needs protecting. Workplace safety, mental health systems, community accountability,